Hello, my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the ChangeStories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk.
Hello and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. My guest today is Antonia Liguori. Antonia, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today.
Many thanks to you. It's a big joy for me to be here today with you.
I'm very excited. Let me explain a bit about who you are. So you are a professor of participatory storytelling and public policy at the School of Social Sciences, Humanities and Law at Teeside University, UK, and a world-leading expert in digital storytelling. Over her career, she's had the privilege to experience a very diverse and exciting pathway, both in the heritage and the media sector in Italy and in academia in the UK. Antonia's been involved in a variety of international research projects to develop tools and methods to foster innovation in education, to explore the role of storytelling and memories in today's digital world, to investigate and trial ways of using digital storytelling as a participatory methodology for interdisciplinary research. And over the past 5 years, Antonia's research has been focusing on three main strands: applied storytelling on environmental issues, digital storytelling in cultural and heritage education, and storytelling sense of place and cultural values. I'm very excited to talk to you because your research is amazing and I want to find out more about it.
And I'm very passionate about it. So you will hear from the sound of my voice sometimes. I will get excited.
I am very excited because I think I was very pleased to meet you a few years ago at the Digital Storytelling Conference at Loughborough. You've since obviously moved universities, so yes, very interested to hear about your research. But how did you first get into storytelling? Because your background is quite varied. You've done computer science, you've done history, you've done all sorts of different things. So how did you get into storytelling first of all?
So there is a long answer and a short answer. I will give you the short answer first, and then we can dive in and contextualize it a bit more. But everything was thanks to a dear friend of mine who was a former colleague back in Italy, and her name is Federica Pesce. She set up it's a cooperative, it's a social enterprise called Melting Pro in Rome. And they've been very active over the years. There are 7 wonderful women researchers, very active in the heritage sector. And they've been leading a number of European funded projects funded by the European Commission. And one of those, when Federica was still based at Luigi Sturzo Institute in Rome, was to set up a European network around digital storytelling. And the project was called ENCDIST, and one of the partners was Story Center. So Joe Lambert was involved. At that time, I think their name was the Center for Digital Storytelling still. And so I was invited to a training with Joe Lambert and people from his team, and the training was in Malta. So it was a beautiful opportunity to go and visit a splendid island. And also I was curious about this digital storytelling approach, because as you said, my background is in history, contemporary history, and I've been always fascinated by oral history and social history and what we would call micro-histories, plural. And then a detail that you need to know is that in Italian, we use the same word for history and story.
Oh.
So for me, it wasn't a big jump because, it was all about people telling what they know and what they experience in their everyday life, or contextualizing their memories depending on where they came from. And the training, of course, with Joe was fascinating, and I was fully captured by this incredible social approach for learning from each other, listening to people's understandings, memories, and in particular emotions. So it added immediately a new layer to my investigation to contemporary history and how people perceive the place in which they live.
Wow. It's so interesting, and thank you for that insight into Italian, because I didn't know that. I was speaking to somebody in Russia recently about storytelling, and he said in Russian there isn't a word for storytelling at all, which I was really surprised about. So yeah, it's interesting.
It is now even more interesting for me because I've been teaching about storytelling over the years in English. And very often I'm invited to Italy to deliver workshops or lectures. And it's hard to translate for me as well.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And yet, culturally, there's a lot of stories, isn't there? So, but I think I like that link between history and story, because in my own PhD was focused on both in organizations. So it was focused on how the stories in organizations help you understand the history, and how that history can either support or hinder attempts to create change. And if you don't gather that history by gathering stories, you miss out on that really important bit of information. So
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would say the word that I would use to translate more effectively and to focus on the way in which I approached storytelling was memory and sharing memories, but also the plurality of those memories. Because I think something that storytelling does is that you never get one way of thinking, you never get one way of feeling, but it's something very complex that comes together in the space. And you really need to somehow appreciate complexity and divergent thinking somehow in groups.
Yeah, that chimes so well with me. And for me, when I started getting interested in storytelling in the organizational change space a few years ago, that was what I was thinking. You know, we had, as consultants, we had such a narrow way of thinking about things. You know, you do this and this and this, and then change will happen. And of course, that doesn't reflect that plurality, the you know, divergent thinking, different perspectives. And then, of course, if people do think differently or do see the world differently, traditionally in the field of organisation change, that was written off as resistance and people being resistant. But actually, I think the world is changing, and it's just a different set of stories and ways of thinking and ways of viewing the world.
Absolutely. And what I really like is the collective aspect of it. So the co-production, the collaborative element of storytelling, in particular if we think about Joe Lambert's model to digital storytelling, the workshop setting and how things happen in the space and how people interact with each other, and the power of those connections that the workshop creates. And also now that, you know, after the pandemic, we learned to work remotely as well, how different those connections are when they are mediated by a screen and, you know, a virtual connection like the one we are experiencing today.
Absolutely. Do you find in your world now, in post-COVID for research, is it gone back to how it was before, that you're now working with people together in a workshop setting, or is it a mixture now of high, you know, online and group work?
I think I always think of change as something positive, and therefore even the change that was imposed by the pandemic had a very positive influence in the way in which we think about working together and making work environments more accessible. And then I had an experience which is sometimes we think in a certain way, and then there are other people who can open our eyes and make us think in a different way again. When we started delivering workshops online, I was a bit worried about, because I really like to read the body language, probably because as an Italian, I'm always moving my hands and feeling and filling the space of this at the same time. So I was very worried about missing that aspect, for example, in certain phases of the digital storytelling workshop, in particular for the story circle. But then I remember I was invited to join a conversation with students at the Montgomery College, that is a community college in the US on the East Coast near Washington, D.C. And they are doing a brilliant program with students around digital storytelling, where they learn how to run a workshop, and then they become facilitators, and then they start working with the community. So they they have this journey and they make the workshop and the practice somehow attached to their understanding of their community. So they adapt the practice depending on the local needs and the needs of the people they work with. And one day, one of them online, it was without the camera. And so I was a bit worried. I said, oh, you know, sometimes when you are talking with students with no camera, they don't engage in what you are saying. Whereas this particular person said, I like the online connection, even during the story circle, because I think it gives us more freedom to express our feelings, because I feel safer without the camera or with the ability to mute myself or switch the camera off. Whereas in a physical space, you would not have that ability, and you would be somehow exposed to your sentiments, even when you feel that you can't. So again, you know, there are some aspects that we perceive as limitations. They can be transformed in something positive, that as an enabler more than as a barrier.
That's interesting, and I do agree with you. I think it creates that accessibility, doesn't it? You know, from what I've read of your research, and you know, your job title is participatory. You know, it's about bringing people in, bringing people together, sharing, listening. You know, trying to solve big problems by bringing people together. And actually, it's not always possible for people to get together physically. And actually, if we have this technology, we can perhaps reach more people.
Yeah, but also socially, sometimes it's harder for people to be connected with other people in the same space. It's more challenging. If we have a diverse range of needs, different ways of learning, as the storytelling process is also a learning process, because as you know, we go through different creative steps. So participants that start, you know, sharing verbally, and then they write a script, and then they record an audio voiceover, and then they learn how to edit a film, and then they are part of a screening. So it can be intimidating in a social environment for some people. Therefore, I think the beauty of this approach, and I think of my research in particular, is that we learn by doing, and we learn by the people we work with all the time. And therefore the practice can evolve, and it's driven by needs. And here, again, I had recently a very interesting conversation with some colleagues from Portugal and Belgium. They are social workers, and they are part of a large international network of street workers. So they work with especially young people who are outside let's say school or any form of formal learning. And they are now applying digital storytelling as a form of non-formal learning, informal learning. And we were talking about needs, and they were saying, oh, needs is not the word we want to use here. So they wanted to actually shift the angle on the positive aspect. So it is more about the expectations of the people we work with, more than thinking about the needs. So needs is still a word that implies a sort of deficit. Whereas they said in our network, in our environment, in the way in which we work, we don't want to talk with this particular target audience about needs, but we want them to express their desired outcomes more than starting from a deficit approach.
Wow. That really resonates with me. I think it's that kind of shifting of the sort of power dynamic, isn't it, between the researcher and the participant. That sort of shift is really important in this type of work.
Absolutely, is essential. And there's sometimes, I think I'm very fortunate because English is not my first language. So very often as we started about, you know, a conversation about meaning, a meaning of a word in particular, a particular word. I mean, by reflecting on meanings and diving in, you know, there's different meanings we can think about, starting from different cultural perspectives. It's not just related to language, but it's related to the way in which we use certain words in different circumstances as well. So it's a very useful exercise to find ways of having a diverse range of understandings and somehow being used to learn from other ways of approaching, even just a simple word.
And I think for me, that learning that you get from listening to other people's stories and sharing stories in that circle environment, however you want to do it, it's incredibly powerful. You never come away from that not having learned something about other people, but also yourself and the environment in which you work. And I'm sure you must feel the same in your research. Every time you do it, it's different and interesting.
Absolutely. And I do the job I do because I love learning more than teaching. And even teaching is for me an opportunity to learn from the people who are sharing the classroom with me. And I think digital storytelling is both a fantastic teaching tool and a wonderful participatory research, action research approach.
So tell me about some of the research you've been doing recently. What in particular have you been working on? Any standout projects that you get really excited about?
Oh, there are many.
I'm sure. I mean,
I've been excited about many projects over the years, but I can tell you about some important experiences, both personally and professionally, and also experiences that gave me the opportunity to rethink about the practice of digital storytelling and how to make it really accessible and meaningful. Because one of the challenges is that sometimes a digital storytelling workshop to really be successful, and again, we could talk about being a successful workshop for hours and and having long conversations about that. But sometimes, if we want to simplify that, sometimes is more successful if the facilitator is very experienced, which is a challenge because the facilitator can't be in a particular project or reality forever. So something I'm trying to understand is how to enable people to become facilitators without losing the depth of the practice per se, and therefore the understanding of the practice. So it's about nourishing the passion for this practice without simplifying it too much to become it accessible for more and more facilitators to run it. So it's quite a difficult aspect. And therefore, in many research projects, instead of thinking about myself as the facilitators of all the workshops, I tend to embed train the trainers or training for researchers in a way that then we use the training not only for the researchers to learn about the practice, but also to design together a new practice that is feasible and accessible in their own environment. And something that made me very excited was a project I'm part of as an advisory board member that is based in New Zealand and is led by the University of Wellington and is about chronic pain. So I'm not an expert in chronic pain at all. And is led by, of course, their physiotherapist with a particular focus on the Maori community, working in both Wellington and Auckland. So the partners are also from the University of AUT, Auckland University of Technology. They're also psychologists. So what happened, I was invited to spend a month with them to learn about the project, understand what they found out by interviewing their patients. And the key question is understanding how to deliver a service, how the national health system in New Zealand could deliver a better service for the Maori community that is more, let's say, culturally appropriate. And therefore, we thought of using digital storytelling as a complementary research approach, in addition to other qualitative research methods, like one-to-one interviews, to understand their experience of being supported during their pain journey, with a particular focus on the use of opioids and why for some of them has been lasting for 20 years. it should not happen. So what I did, I went there, I learned about their research, I learned about the outcome of the initial findings, and then we ran sort of taster sessions with groups of researchers, and then we designed together the workshop that then was run with the Maori community, with members of the Maori community, with myself, let's say, facilitating the story circle, and then the researchers, the group of researchers facilitating all the other phases of the first workshop. And then a month after, of course, in the meantime, we had reflections, we understood how to improve certain aspects. And then the month after, the group in Auckland, they delivered their own workshop. So was a sort of journey we shared together with both the researchers, the patients, to co-design together a digital storytelling workshop approach that could work well for that particular subject, that particular research question, and with that group. And therefore, even just thinking about the venue where to run such a workshop. So we wanted to hear from the patients where they would feel that there was what space was the most appropriate for them to share difficult and challenging experiences. Also considering their sometimes different physical abilities. So is it better in a university room near the hospital? Is it better in a marae? And the marae is the traditional community space for the Maori community to gather and the traditional sharing of story. So the workshop we ran was in a marae. And for me personally, it was just an incredible experience. I still have a book they gave me there that is called Aroa. Aroa means love, but it's a much richer word for describing love, because it includes empathy, it includes listening, and it includes, all those kind of attitudes that I think a good facilitator should somehow experience and improve and try to work on.
Wow, what an experience. It sounds incredible.
It does, and it was there was music as well. There were moments for prayer, and it was so rich and so inspiring, because it's about somehow readapting the digital storytelling methodology to existing practices. And some existing practices, they have the same holistic approach to community-based mutual support, which is the essence of storytelling. And by community, we can mean any type of community. Yeah.
Fascinating. I find that really interesting, and I think a couple of things really stood out for me in that idea of co-designing something together. So if you think about the sort of traditional research way of doing things, the researcher comes in, says this is the way we're going to do it, they do it, and then off they go. And I think it's so powerful, that idea of creating something together, but so much better, that at the end of the day, everyone participating gets something out of it.
And they also are eager to continue running those types of workshops, because they are embedded in their own culture and their own way of connecting with other people. Or they may create new ways of connecting with other people for some participants who had no opportunities to be listened to, which is very often the case.
Yeah. And I like that idea too of being more sustainable in terms of creating more people or enabling more people to facilitate and building those skills in different people, because I do think it's a bit of an art, isn't it? Is making an environment where people feel comfortable to share their story. There's an art to that, and it does take experience.
Yes, but it's also true that we can adapt certain approaches in a way that we can. I'll give you an example. For example, the story circle. Traditionally, there is the facilitator enabling participants in sharing verbally their first idea of a story, sometimes using prompts sometimes using an object as a starting point for a conversation. But very often I'm now using a collective co-facilitator approach. And it's something that I started in a workshop I ran in a school with teenagers a few years ago, because I was worried that I never had experience of running workshops with very young people. And I was worried about keeping them active and excited during the whole process, because very often you have people who just switch on and switch off, depending on if they are talking or if a friend of them is talking, and therefore they are interested in listening. So I thought about this shared co-facilitation where I would start to show them how it works. And then we would set some rules for the group in terms of, active listening, respect. There is nothing that is right, nothing that is wrong. All those kind of, being supportive in providing feedback, asking questions, even if we don't have questions, be prepared to ask at least one, all these kind of things. And then I would ask each of them to facilitate the storytelling. For example, if I'm the storyteller, then the one on the right is the facilitator, the one on the left is the timekeeper. And then we go around the circle in this way, so that we all experience the different roles. Because even being the timekeeper is a very hard role, especially for an Italian. But anyway, but it's just small little changes that can make this process more accessible and, as you said, sustainable, because then next time they already know what to do.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. For me, being able to tell stories and enable others to share their stories is a skill that everyone needs to have. The world I inhabit around organizations, it is something essential for leaders, I think. Everyone needs to be able to do it. It's so important to create change. And I notice in your work a lot, you talk about using storytelling to connect and to share knowledge, but also to generate change. And I think for me, that's one of the most powerful things about storytelling.
Yeah, the other thing I've been learning from people is that stories are not just about the past.
No.
So we can use storytelling also to imagine the future. And for example, I was involved, the reason why I moved to the UK from a very nice job I had in Italy was because I found this crazy job at Loughborough 10 years ago, and they were looking for someone with an understanding of digital storytelling and a PhD at the same time, which is not always easy to find. And was a project around drought and flooding. So it was about climate change. So the drought flooding nexus in the UK. And so the idea was to use digital storytelling as a way of merging or combining or bridging different types of knowledge across different sectors of society. And was a very interdisciplinary team. The majority of the academics, they were from natural sciences, they were hydrologists, for example. So we were thinking about how to maximize the use of storytelling, thinking about the future impact of climate change, and therefore using climate change scenarios as a context for a future storytelling exercise. And therefore we developed some tools like storyboarding techniques to enable people to better grasp the science, but also to contextualize the science to their current life and think about, the future implications in the different scenarios. And the scientists as well, they use the story language to make the data more accessible. And some of them, they were great storytellers. As soon as we gave them the opportunity to share a story, it was just an immediate shift to a different tone in the conversation. They made the conversation much more democratic and the exchange much easier for everyone.
Yeah, well, it's how the human brain works, right? Isn't it? Well, our brain works. It's a storytelling machine. And so anything that we can do that enables us to tap into that ability in our brain, it just makes it easier for us to to process information and to share information.
Yes. Yeah. And the sharing is another aspect, because every time we join a research project, we start the conversation, especially in an interdisciplinary context. We start the conversation about the use of storytelling for dissemination. So very often we are invited as storytelling experts in helping the hard sciences better communicate their research. Whereas my battle, and the battle of many colleagues who are doing this work, is that actually storytelling is not just a tool for dissemination, but is a tool for discovery. So it's a tool for research, it's a tool for engaging in research, to make research more democratic. For engaging in research, people would not be usually engaged in research, and therefore to make research much more connected with our daily life.
And that's so important. I really like that from the research I've done into your research that you've been doing. That democracy and that involvement and that engagement is so important. And I absolutely agree with you. I think for me, working with stories is like archaeology. It's like uncovering the detail. It's getting underneath everything, rather than just as a communication tool. It's a great communication tool, but it's
Absolutely.
so much more to it than that, isn't there?
Yeah, no, you're right. And thinking about your work around change, recently I had a colleague, we were having a chat about the difference between, because very often we say lived experiences when we talk about storytelling. And then we had this conversation about living experiences, so that it's not something in the past, but it's something that is ever evolving. And therefore it's even more important to grasp that sort of, movement that happens in our everyday life, and to intersect and interact with that evolving picture we create in our brain through storytelling, and therefore then enact change in a less traumatic way, because it's not something that has been done and is completed, but it's something that is ever evolving.
Oh my goodness, yes, that resonates so much with my own research and my own experience. I think when I've been an organisation change consultant for over 25 years, and when I first started out, it was very much like you, as I said, you did this, you had this plan, and then you did that, and that was the end. And you did a bit of stakeholder engagement at the beginning, and then you expected that to stay the same, and you never went back to it. And of course, it's not how we work. And when I was doing my own doctoral research, I met with the same group of people every 6 to 8 weeks for about 3 years while they were going through a big organisation transformation, and talked to them about how they were feeling. And they changed constantly. Sometimes they liked what was happening. Sometimes they really hated it. Other times they were ambivalent. And it seems really obvious, but I thought to myself, well, of course, this is how we are. We change opinion. We're humans. We can hold 2 different opinions or more at the same time. And that's what's missing, I think, in a lot of the way that perhaps research is done and how organisations work, is this understanding, exactly as you said, that we continually develop and change.
And it's the same sort of embarrassment that some people, they have, not embarrassment, but the challenge of telling a story. For example, even in the last experience I was describing, there were some participants that were thinking they had to tell the whole story of the whole life. Whereas what is beautiful of storytelling is that we can actually tell more than one story. so we can dive in and focus in. It's like, that now we use any type of map on any digital device. We can zoom in and zoom out. And that's both in time and space. And this is just incredible. It is difficult, but sometimes starting by zooming in, it's a great enabler of storytelling and story listening as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. And people are a bit intimidated sometimes. What I find in my work, you might find the same, is that people feel that they're not very good storytellers. I'm like good in quotation marks, because I don't think there's no such thing, is there? It's just a story, and everyone's story is interesting, but people have a view of what good storytelling looks like and feel like they don't fit that picture.
Yes, and the other challenge is that sometimes active listening is not perceived as an important act of participation. Whereas, again, another fight I'm doing in participatory action research by using storytelling is that participation can have different forms. So we don't participate in the same way. So there might be people who are able only to listen for a certain time. And by listening, they are still providing feedback to other people in a social context. And therefore, even if they are not ready to share their story, their role is still important in a social environment. And therefore, I'm trying to work more on this aspect of story listening as a way of enabling participants, especially when we talk about difficult topics. Depending on the context in which storytelling happens, it might be more difficult. And I had an example of a student, because I've been running digital storytelling workshops with students in Loughborough in particular. And she felt overwhelmed during the story circle because she never had the opportunity to be carefully heard or listened. And therefore, she thought she was not ready for the story circle. And then we did a different type of exercise. There was a collaborative storyboarding where they were working in pairs. And this is something I created for them, prompted by that challenge. So then I decided, okay, this group is too intimidating. Let's try in another way, in a more intimate space. Of course, we ran the story cycle as it was. So I didn't create that as a response to a problem because there was no problem. But then we ran this activity in pair, and I said, okay, one of you will act as the storyteller, and the other one as the story listener. The story listener is there to capture the story that the teller is sharing on a storyboard by drawing, asking questions, drafting notes for the script. And this person then told me after a few months that process was transformative. Because then she was able to articulate her narrative, her story, her experience in a more intimate space. And then at the end, she wanted to share the film. So the lack of ability or the lack of, confidence in sharing a story in the first instance doesn't mean a resistance to the sharing phase. So I think something that we need to learn in our own practice is to identify different languages, different ways, different environments, different dynamics to enable that process to happen, and recognizing that active listening is as important as telling and sharing a personal narrative.
Gosh, I wholeheartedly agree. And I do think that listening is a very underrated skill. Organizations are very noisy places, and there's a lot of talk, I find, but not a lot of proper listening goes on.
The challenge is time.
Yes, yeah, it is, and I think it's hugely difficult. And I think it's something that people find difficult. I don't always find it that easy to, I know how to do it, but I find myself drifting off sometimes when I'm trying to listen really closely and thinking about what's for tea and all of that sort of thing. And it's noticing it and bringing yourself back is part of the process. But I really like that idea of story listening. I think that's a really important thing for people to think about and to develop. Wow. I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours about your research, but we're coming to the end of the time that we have together, which is such a shame, because we could talk all day about how to create a story circle. I know that, but we haven't got time. So if people are interested in finding out more about you and your work, where's the best place for them to go and take a look?
I have a little blog, so with my name and surname .blog. Just make sure that my surname is spelled with UO and not OU, which often happens in English-speaking countries. And then the university website where where possible, I publish all the publications as open access. And then we are creating a new collection on the Smithsonian Learning Lab. I was very lucky to be a fellow at the Smithsonian in 2018, and I've been working with them over the years. And now we are developing a new open access Smithsonian Learning Lab collection that will be promoted in the next months, in which we will be exploring digital stories and storytelling with colleagues across a number of countries worldwide. And therefore that will be a fantastic place, not just to see and read about my work, but actually to be connected with this large community of practice that is, as you know, is well connected and is very diverse. We've got something to say that we are now supporting the organization of the next digital storytelling conference that will be in Brazil in 2025, November 2025. And it will be in conjunction with COP30. So it will be a digital storytelling conference mainly focusing on environment and environmental issues, and will be hosted by the Museu da Pessoa, which is a wonderful institution in Brazil, and the conference will be hosted in the land.
Wow, I'm clearing my diary as you speak. And have you had, I can't remember the dates, you've got something coming up in Zakynthos as well, haven't you? Is that the end of September?
Yes, end of September, there is a first Digital Storytelling Festival. So something that the International Committee decided to organize, because the Digital Storytelling Conference is every 2 years. So in the year when there is no conference, then there is our colleagues in Greece, they decided to open the beautiful land and the beautiful island to host the first Digital Storytelling Conference. There will be a screening, like a film festival. And there will be different themes to organize the program.
You get to go to all the best places. I will, and thanks for sharing about the Smithsonian. I'll be having a look at that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, even if you just browse now the Smithsonian Learning Lab and you search for digital storytelling within the Smithsonian collections, you will see that there are many educators especially in the US, who are creating a digital storytelling collection on the Smithsonian.
Wow, amazing. Thank you. And thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. It's been really wonderful and really inspiring to talk to you. Your research is fantastic. I'm excited to see what you do next.
Many thanks to you, and I'm excited to listen to your next podcast.
Thanks, Antonia.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.